So let me start off. And what I want to try to do is not try to take your mind away from what we just talked about. And I want us to think about this. First of all, this image, which struck me when I first saw it, this guy showing up in chains, carrying his legal files to represent himself in court. So I want to talk about, it's just one thing. I want to talk about the legacy of Muslims in prison when it comes to prison law. That's the main thing I want to do. It's something that has been going on for decades that people do not really know much about. And so within going through that legacy, it's literally a living legacy because it's been happening for decades and is still happening. So within showing you this legacy, I would also like to make a couple of arguments. So the first argument is a religious studies argument, which is to say that the litigation that Muslims engage in, it's not disproportionate just by happenstance. What I want to argue is to say that there's something about the Islamic tradition. There's something inherent about Islam that the ideology is pushing some of the litigation. It's people's beliefs, whether taken from the Quran or taken from tradition, that's actually propelling the litigation. So I want to try to prove that to you, that ideology is helping push this phenomenon. And the second thing is a more legal argument, which is to say that through the litigation, Muslims are advancing, expanding the rule of law, right? Expanding the rule of law. Try to imagine that before the 1960s, there was no such thing as civil rights in prison, right? The courts adopted this hands-off approach, which meant federal courts didn't really care about what happened in state prisons for a century and a half. So there was no such thing as a civil right in prison in the early times. So when you think about what Muslims have done, change policy, change laws, change the culture of prisons through the litigation. So when I say expanding the rule of law, I mean more people are protected for more rights. So again, coming from a history where there were no rights, we have to say that holding institutions accountable, getting your day in court, those are all the cherished ideals that we hold when we talk about the rule of law. Okay, so we'll talk, that's mine. Is there a clicker?
No, it's here.
Yeah, this is the one.
It's just here. You can use the mouse.
Oh, okay. That's great. I'll try that. Thank you.
There's buttons on the left-hand corner. There you go. Yeah.
Great. So what is this book about? What am I really trying to do in terms of the things that you will pull from the book itself? Right. So one of the first things I want to mention is it's the Nation of Islam that starts this whole thing. So members of the Nation of Islam are who sparked the movement. Individuals who were thrown into solitary confinement for claiming to be Muslim. Individuals who were beaten, tortured, they were surveyed. And this was done in the 1950s and 1960s. So one of the things that my book also lays out is that when you want to talk about this thing called Islamophobia, we tend to think about it in terms of 9/11 and then afterwards. My book challenges a lot of that to say that at least one of the ground zeros of Islamophobia was in the 1950s, 1960s treatment of Americans in prison. And so the Nation of Islam members are the ones that really bore the brunt of this mistreatment for trying to establish Islam in prison. Justice and equality are what are in the minds of these litigants. This is why they do what they do. And so taking verses from the Quran, taking ideas from tradition is sort of what everything is built around. Much of the litigation, just so you know, has nothing to do with Muslims at all. It has to do with changing laws that affect everyone in prison. And so Muslims have stood up, not just for themselves, but also for others in prison and gotten into a lot of trouble for being jailhouse lawyers for others as well. So the other thing to recognize is that converts are very important in this whole procedure. Anybody have any religious studies background or know much about conversion or converts to a religion? Do we know anything about sort of like the determination, the vigor, the energy? Like converts bring lots of determination to the table. And so you can imagine what it's like, right? To have this newfound religion, you're very pumped up. You might have changed your name, your clothes, your food. And the administration saying, no, you can't practice your religion, or no, you can't have the Quran, or no. And so you imagine what that is like in the mind of someone who is very fired up for religion. And so one of the common denominators is converts are doing the suing. That's one of the common denominators. Religion comes into the picture at multiple entry points. And this is the point I want to emphasize. So when we're talking about this kind of litigation, obviously we could be talking about a lawsuit about whether I can have this religious paraphernalia. So when the litigation involves a religious issue, it's clearly religious. And it's not just that Muslims are doing the lawsuits. That's also a part of how religion seeps in, but it's also that the ideas of Islam are what are guiding these people into court. I've already talked about the conversion part. So religion, multiple entry points, if you really think about it. So you can't separate religion from the law here. And hopefully by the time I'm done, we'll get to some findings that I hope you find are, a little bit counterintuitive, almost paradoxical. When we think about what Muslims have been doing in prison since the 1950s and 1960s. Now, before I want to, sort of move on, just to clarify, the lawsuits that I'm talking about, we're not talking about trying to fight your case in criminal court. That's not what these lawsuits are about. These lawsuits are not about challenging the fact or duration of your confinement, such as habeas corpus. It's not about that. These are all basically conditions of confinement. So basically civil rights cases. So it's not people are trying to get out of prison or trying to change their sentence, trying to change the conditions of prisons. In prisons, if we know, not nice places by 2023 standards. Imagine 1950s, you had a bucket for a toilet. Malcolm X talks about this. So just to recognize what type of lawsuits we're talking about. Okay, so it says there on the top, Islam in American prisons. So I just want us to think about sort of what happens sometimes. And so here's Malcolm X, sort of pimp, hustler, street pro, and he encounters Islam in prison, and this is where he is years later on Hajj, right? He's in Mecca, he's changing his racial beliefs as it was happening. So one thing to recognize for some, this idea of sacred space, prison being a sacred space for some who end up converting. Now, if you're familiar with Malcolm X's biography, he had some very intense spiritual encounters. So for example, he talks about the prison walls being what saw him where he couldn't kneel. He had to force himself to kneel, and then he got back up. He couldn't kneel to pray. And so he says the prison walls saw this. And so, the prison isn't just a place, but it's a place that witnesses your transformation. And so he says that it was in prison where he first learned to be free. So imagine that. It was the first time he said that his thoughts melted away from him. His old way of thinking, the way snow falls off a rooftop, just in chunks, just slid away from his thinking. And so, of course, as I mentioned, Muslims have always faced special challenges and religious persecution. Just if you look at the plaintiff in the Cooper v. Pate case, which was the 1964 case that opened up civil rights in prison for the most part, just look at the facts of that case. He was put in solitary confinement simply for claiming to be Muslim. He wanted to try to get some religious literature, nothing. And so they ended up radicalizing this person into the jailhouse lawyer extraordinaire. And so he ended up litigating all kinds of cases, spent years in solitary, tried to help out others with their legal cases, got punished more. So sometimes the challenge, is not just sort of trying to establish Islam, but sometimes the persecution comes from the guards, not because you're Muslim, but because I'm Christian and I think I'm better than you. So there's Christian superiority that happens as well. So the persecution isn't just because of someone's identity, but because of the guard's identity. And so all of this kind of pushes the Muslim will to litigate. And when I say litigate, I mean that we're talking about a real legacy. Here's a couple of just facts for you to digest. U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and Religious Freedom in U.S. prisons found that incarcerated Muslims between 2005, 2007 submitted the largest number of religious discrimination complaints of any religious group. They also made the largest number of religious accommodation requests from 1997 to 2008 and initiated the largest number of federal lawsuits, 74 out of 250, under the RLUIPA statute, that was from 2001 to 2006. So again, I want you to just think about these raw numbers. So sometimes 25 to 30% of all federal cases are by Muslim litigants. So 30% of cases, but on the outside, Muslims comprise 1% of the American population. So I want you to just see how disproportionate this is. 1% of the American population, yet in some years, 30% of all federal litigation. So it's a huge, disproportionate, the disproportionality is just, it's pretty staggering. And when you hear some of these other sort of accomplishments, you see that there's got to be something else. There's got to be some other factors to think about why these numbers are so huge. Why it is that you cannot talk about the prisoners' rights movement, for example, without invoking a bunch of Muslim litigants, because the prisoners' rights movement was a Muslim movement for all practical purposes. We looked at who some of those litigants were. Right, so now I want us to think about, we know enough about the prisoners' rights movement. We know that Muslim litigants have been very active for the last few decades. Here's where my book actually comes in and contributes something. And that is to think about, what is it about their beliefs? What is it about Islam that actually influences or inspires or motivates individuals to take up this arduous task of litigation? And when I say arduous, I mean it in the sense that Professor Cohen's here, she's an expert on all of this. But it's pretty safe to say that by filing a grievance in prison, or even getting to the stage of litigation, you are telling on your captors. You're telling on the people who watch you day in and day out. Sometimes there can be retaliation, shakedowns, strip searches, all kinds of things can happen just for you telling on your captors. And then, of course, when you try to get that case to federal court, there's legislation like the Prison Litigation Reform Act that changes everything for you because you're in prison. And so all sorts of hurdles to get through. And so why do people take up this work, knowing that you're almost knowing you're always going to lose, for one thing, but then also all the hardships that it brings. And so I want to sort of get us to be thinking. I'm just going to show some images from early Nation of Islam publications. And you can see that justice, racial equality, and prisons are at the center of their pedagogy. This is what they want. All of the publications pretty much say, we want justice for the Black man in America. Right? That was Elijah Muhammad's real pull when it came to the Nation of Islam. But even when we think about in Islamic tradition, and of course traditions, but I want to sort of call your attention that there's even exhortations for Muslims to stand up to injustice, even when other Muslims are perpetuating that. Right? O ye who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah, even as against yourselves. So there's a duty, even when it's a Muslim. So when it comes to oppression and tyranny, the Quran is pretty unequivocal about resisting that tyranny and about the safety and sanctity of one's fellow human. And so I want us to sort of think about there are verses that basically liken those who stand up to oppression are like saviors given by the grace of God. So just try to think about that. I can go in and give some Quranic verses, but try to imagine what that means. The Quran says that standing up to oppression likens someone to the grace or savior of God. Try to wrap your head around that. You've gone from being the lowest on the lowest rung in American society. If you want to think about intersectionality, when we get to the very bottom, a Black Muslim in prison who's broke is at the very bottom. Okay, so in terms of intersectionality and power, we've got to say that they're at the very, very bottom of society. In fact, many of us want to forget that they're even there, right? That's our saying, lock them up and throw away the key. And so try to imagine from that position, using litigation, using your voice, your activity, you can rise to the grace of God, right? You are the one giving mercy now. So it's a radical transformation to be sure, to go from such a lowly position all of a sudden to what the Quran says is a savior. And in fact, if you think about Malcolm X's autobiography, that's how he charts out his chapters in prison. He starts out as Satan, then he goes to saved, because he converted, and then he went to, what was the last one? Savior. And so Satan, saved, savior. Not what I wanted to do. So just thinking about some of the images in the Nation of Islam's publication, literally seeing Islam as a way to set people free, whether literally get out and don't recidivate or literally set people free, as Malcolm said. You know, and of course, for many people coming from a criminal background, prison may be the first time ever to sit down and read a book, ever to contemplate, study, right? So Malcolm X, another example, he studied history, literature, debate. He read the dictionary from A to Z. And so set off this educational firestorm for him. And I also want to call attention to this very important and famous hadith, and I'll sort of call out Professor Aziz on this because she's written on this, but it's on this saying, whosoever sees an evil. So whosoever sees an evil, let him change it with his hand. And if he is not able to do so, then let him change it with his tongue. And if he is not able to do so, then with his heart. That is the weakest faith. Right? So from this perspective, there are levels to protest, if you will. Right? The lowest level being you see something, and in your mind, at least in your heart, you're protesting it. In your mind, you're thinking that is wrong. That's not right. A higher level of protest, or at least, you know, the next step up would be to say something. Hey, that's wrong. Stop that. Leave them alone. Right? And you're actually articulating something. It's a higher level of faith. And then the most faith would be to do something about it. Use your hand. Take some action. And so countless people who have written to me and I've talked to who are in prison, that is their inspiration. That is the guiding force that lets them be spiritual activists, that let them take their religious beliefs and let it guide them. And where does it take them? It takes them into court, right? And so many see themselves by writing the briefs, by looking up the law, right? They're using their hands. So they're using their hands to fight oppression, right? And so you have all these exhortations to justice and equality in the Quran, and at the same time, you have over 200 entries that admonish against injustice. So it's not just pro, but admonishing against injustice. And so I want to say also that there are similar attitudes and ideas that are taken from the Quran that pushes towards racial equality as well. Again, these are just images from decades ago. This is what was on the Nation of Islam's mind at the time. So from The Quran in different tradition, we have different passages. Among his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth and the diversity of your languages and colors. Verily, in that are signs for people with knowledge. So skin color, different languages, all of that is an extension of creative power. It's not a mishap as we've treated it as humans, but it's a sign of divine power. Verily, Allah Almighty created Adam from a handful, which he took from the earth. So the children of Adam come in accordance with the earth. Some come with red skin, white skin, or black skin, and whatever is in between, thick, thin, dirty, and clean. So the premise is very simple. We're equal because we are all made from the same earth, and that earth comes in different colors, hence we come in different colors. And so we have to think about what this means to somebody who's typically African-American, stuck in prison, sometimes for wrong reasons. Oh, people, your Lord is one and your father Adam is one. There is no favor of an Arab over a foreigner, nor a foreigner over an Arab, and neither white skin over black skin, nor black skin over white skin, except by righteousness. So it's your righteousness, it's how your character is, which determines who you are. And of course, when you think of racial equality, you're thinking about the African-American condition in this country. You think about when it was time for the Muslims to come together for the very first time and pray, right? Who did the Prophet Muhammad call? He called Bilal, an African ex-slave, to call everyone to prayer. So just imagine how bold a move that was, to call an ex-slave to say, you are the purest, therefore you call everyone to pray. That's, in terms, again, thinking about racial equality, this is putting your money where your mouth is just by doing that. So there's lots in the Quran and in tradition to really push this idea of racial equality, racial justice. And of course, that can be very appealing when you're sitting and rotting in prison. Some of it may have to do with your Islamic background. Some of it may have to do with the fact that you're broke, or some of it may have to do with the fact that you're Black, right? So these hit differently when you think about the context as well. So, yeah. Did that work? Yeah, thank you. All right. So on the top there, it says Muslim litigiosity, seeking justice through spiritual activism. So, does anybody know who this is, by chance? So this is the plaintiff from the case Holt v. Hobbs, which is a 2015 Supreme Court decision. And this is Gregory Holt, who also goes by the name of Abdul Malik Muhammad. And he's sued so that Muslims, well, actually it turned out to be so everyone could wear a half-inch beard in prison. At his prison, there was no beard wearing at all, only mustaches. So kind of think of the irony of that, but only mustaches, no beards. He sued. There had been litigation all over the country at the state level and the federal level trying to get this rule. And so he is my model. He is my poster boy for this thesis that I'm trying to put forward, because he's in the middle of a whole bunch of lawsuits right now. He is like the litigator par excellence. He's involved, for example, in the case right now, so that he identifies as a Sunni Muslim. He wants space so that Sunnis can worship separately from the Nation of Islam, worship separately from the 5% Nation of Islam. He says, that's not us. That's not who we are. He says, you don't make Jewish people and Christian people come into the same room to worship. Why should you do it to us, Muslims? This is very different. And he's argued also, if you think about it, I don't think there's ever been a time where Christians had to litigate in order to have separate space for Catholics, separate space for Protestants, etc. It's always been given. In fact, when prisons first opened for business, you were given a Bible. You were just given a Bible when you went in. Right? So there was no separation of church and state at that level at that time. And so he has that case. He's trying to get himself off of this terrorist watch list for some language he used in the phone call. And so he's in battle in all kinds of litigation. I just asked him one time, why do you do this? Like, why do you have so many cases going on, and why do you litigate? He says, justice and the taking of power from oppressors who seek to destroy Islam by watering it down. Arkansas is still stuck in the plantation era, and a lot of my incarcerated brethren are mental slaves. Muslims do not allow their deen to be directed or co-opted by those who wish it to fit how they want it to be. Islam enjoins the right and forbids the wrong. If there was one thing that I heard more than anything else in my interactions with people in prison, Islam enjoins the right and forbids the wrong. But that is sort of what I'm trying to get at, where ideology, action, and the rule of law have aligned in praxis. He knows what he's doing. He knows that he's putting his Islamic ideas into effect. That's praxis. So what it forces us to do is a couple of things. Is to realize that, at least from the religious study or the academic study of religion, we need to rethink what religious expression can look like, how expressing one's religious duty can look. So I come from a Hindu background. It's my religious. So when I go to temple, there's someone ringing a bell. Incense is all over the place. You smell food, there's offerings, there's music, people are chanting and dancing. It's loud. It's really chaotic. But I can see, oh, that's a religious act. Oh, I see that in front of the altar. That's a religious act. Incense, that's a religious act. But many people wouldn't think about going to court as an expression of religiosity, even though that's what many of these litigants say. It's my duty as a Muslim to either stand up for me or to stand up for someone else, right? I'm obliged to do this. So that's why I've taken this term and I've kind of coined this idea of Muslim litigiosity. Litigiosity being the fusion of the will to litigate, litigiosity and religiosity. When those two come together, the will to litigate, guided by your religious ideas, Muslim litigiosity. So again, what I'm trying to say is that you could look at all of these lawsuits and say, what a lot of lawsuits, and by a lot of Muslims, and think there's a correlation there. My argument is that it's less correlation and more causation. It's not that there are a bunch of lawsuits by Muslims, but there's a lawsuit because he's Muslim. So it's a causal relationship. It's caused by this individual being Muslim. So we really need to think about that. So that's my, everybody has to coin a term, right, when you write a book. So Muslim litigiosity was my way of showing how religiosity can fuse with action in this kind of way, where you could say, okay, it's like a joke sometimes, sometimes I'll just, just joke with people, like, what's your book about? And it's like, well, little rib. And I say, I'm talking about I'm saying that Muslims sue religiously. You get it? Like, they sue religiously. And that's really what I'm trying to get at, is those religious aspects of the lawsuit that make the development of prison law jurisprudence inextricable from Muslims in the United States. You cannot separate it, right? And so this is sort of what I'm really trying to get at, and that's the contribution of my book. We've known that Muslims have been involved, but we never knew what was pushing them to be involved. So I'm gonna spare you more commentary on this and just get to these ironies or contradictions or counterintuitive findings that I think my work points to. So it's not that the findings in my work are limited to prisons, limited to people in prison, and we don't have to worry about it because we're out here. It's not like that at all. I find many things to think about that implicate us on the outside. So the first thing I want to bring out is that when you study enough cases and you look at this area of law, it's very interesting because you have like a role reversal that goes on, in the sense that the lawbreaker, the Muslim, the convict, ends up becoming a lawmaker through litigation. You're creating law, you're changing policy. So literally the lawbreaker becomes the lawmaker. And on the flip side, we have scenes like this coming out of prisons weekly. What does that mean? It means that the guards are the ones who look like criminals, and that's these litigants who tend to look like the law makers, the upholders of the law. So for example, in that middle picture, in prison, in some prison systems, some individuals spend a very short time only in sobriety. Does everybody understand that? They spend little time in sobriety. How in the heck is that possible? Because guards bring in all kinds of stuff, all kinds of drugs, all kinds of contraband. So yes, you can be in prison and stay intoxicated for a long time, or if you got connections. So again, one finding, lawbreakers turn lawmakers, and then the people who are supposed to be helping with rehabilitation, helping these people come out of prison, showing them the value of leading a law-abiding life. Like, this is why it's good to be clean and not have, and do any crime. Meanwhile, they're engaged in some of the most criminal conduct. So that's one. I also want to say that it tempers these ideas that Muslims in the United States are trying to install Sharia law and want to reject American law. No, they don't. Not in prison, at least. Not in prison. Prison is, the whole thing is building on precedent from previous cases and building future going forward. So we cannot talk about prison law without Muslims. So what I'm trying to contribute is a missing piece to American Islam, but also a missing piece in the law. It's trying to understand how religion plays such a role. So not really trying to dethrone American law, but operating meticulously within the American legal structure and contributing to it. And just like Muslims on the outside of prison, very content to get their divorces through the civil courts, to sue on personal injury grounds in civil courts. So this idea that we want to overthrow the law, no, it doesn't really seem that way. ISPU did a report saying, people are very satisfied to use American courts to handle their legal grievances. So really it tempers these ideas of, sort of what Muslims are up to when it comes to American law. Also, the idea that in prison, you have this radicalization problem among Muslims. Again, 3 congressional hearings on the issue of radicalization among Muslims, not one concrete example of it ever happening. I mean, someone radicalizing to the point of committing some extremist violent act. We just don't have it. And this is our United States federal government, the research agency, admitting this. We don't have any examples. So 3 congressional hearings, not one concrete case of what you're talking about. So the idea that Islam is radicalizing people inside prison, it's not true. What's happening, and so Peter King, for example, was really big on saying, oh, there's a jihad happening in prison, it's violent, fertile soil for prison jihad. Make no mistake, there is a prison jihad happening, but it has nothing to do with violence. It's not sensationalized. It's not on the front screen of your TV. It's not on the headlines of your newspaper. This is slow. It lumbers across decades in time for these cases to get through the docket. But it's a struggle, right? But it's a very different one that involves changing law, arguing for new precedent, etc. So there's a struggle going on, but it has nothing to do with violence. It has to do, in fact, this is quite boring. This is a lumbering process, and it shows that rather than sort of take this radical stance and sort of these other modes of protest, what people in prison do is quite conventional. It's quite normative to sue. In fact, to say, I'll see you in court in this country is very basic. That's what we do. We're Americans. We're one of the most litigious groups, litigious countries on the planet here in the United States. We love that. See you in court, MFR, whatever. But we are litigious, and that is what Muslims are in prison as well. So very conventional, very normative, quite the opposite of radical, if you really ask me. Another thing I want to mention kind of points to that image of them walking up the stairs. And that is that most litigants, almost all of them know they're going to lose their case. Muslims lose overwhelmingly in court. You're going to lose. You know, it's a good argument, you're going to lose. Okay. So how do the numbers keep growing? How do the numbers keep getting bigger? Like, despite all the losses, keep marching to court, right? Keep going and making your claims in court. You're going to lose. So I guess if you have insight into these activities that go on, you would have to kind of think that something else is motivating these people other than the win or the loss. Pretty much knowing you're going to lose, then that likely means you're probably doing it for some higher principle, right? And so not being attached to those fruits, but doing it because it's what's right. It's your obligation as a Muslim, right? Your obligation isn't to win or to lose in a court case, it's to try to fight oppression. So here we have it. The numbers keep growing, 30% of federal litigation in some years. Now, finally, I just want to mention a couple of other points. One is that there may be a little bit of blind spotting in my research. And here's why, is that it's very difficult to disaggregate why people are oppressed in prison. And so what it means is that my thesis, I maintain that some of it has to do with ideology influencing people and they're expressing their religious belief. But on the other side of things, that's too simplistic because some people some Muslims don't think anything about religion as they sue. And one person told me point blank, religion had nothing to do with this. Okay, well, what happened? It's the way they treat us here. So this massive litigation, some of it is from religious pushing, but then some of it is also the fact that Muslims are treated worse than all groups in prison. That's just a fact. And so if you're being treated at a higher or mistreated at a higher level at higher rates, then that would also inspire litigation. So that's the blind spot. It's hard to tell what exactly, why someone is litigating. And also thinking about the oppression, as I mentioned before, why is someone being oppressed? Could be because he's Muslim. It could be because he's Black. It could be because he's a criminal, he's in prison, or it could be a previous gang affiliate. So disaggregating that, it's very difficult. And so I'm not claiming to have done that with my work. So I just wanted to mention that some of the litigation may just be a sign of who has it the worst in prison. One other quick thing to mention, as we're talking about this, if you're a Muslim and you get thrown in prison today, you walk in, there's Friday Jummah services, you have other meetings you can go to, you can get literature, you can get whatever, well, not whatever, but you can get the Quran. All of that was done, why? Through groups that many Muslims today would consider heterodoxological. Nation of Islam, those aren't Muslims, yet they paved the way so that Muslims from more traditional historical backgrounds could come and be Muslim in prison. So even though it was groups that some in the mainstream of Islam would not consider Muslim at all, paved the way for Islam to exist in prison, paved the way for you to take for granted these rights, but it was on the backs of Nation of Islam, 5% nation, thrown in solitary, beaten, surveyed, all of that was done through groups that don't even sort of get the status of Muslim by others. And so it's something important to recognize that if it weren't for the Black groups who pushed their way through the court dockets, Islam in prison wouldn't be the same right now. All right. Last thing I'm going to mention, and this is just for you to do a little homework as law students. There's a very terrible thing that happens to people who have cases before federal courts. And that is prisons can transfer you. And they can transfer you at will. And typically that means that if you have a claim for injunctive relief, civil rights case, and you have injunctive relief or some sort of declaratory relief you're looking for, that kills it. So you're done. So you could have suffered immensely at the hands of a prison and then finally go through all those hurdles, the retaliation, the cell shakedowns, strip searches, mistreatment, et cetera, finally get your case to court. and then the prison ships you to a different unit, that will kill your court case. So it's a really terrible thing. And I just want to say courts gave that power to the prisons by saying you can basically transfer at will. And as you all know, you can transfer across state lines. You can transfer someone across state lines, no problem. So you can transfer at will. In fact, solitary confinement, no problem. We'll call it ADSEG and say it's administrative. So we're going to throw you in solitary, but just say it's for our administrative purposes. So there's no restriction really. And so the courts did that. And then they adopted this doctrine of mootness and applied it to prison transfer. So if you have been transferred to a new unit, then the court is going to say, wink, wink, prisons, we'll dismiss this claim. So this person suffered all these injustices, finally got the court case in federal court, and then gets transferred. Everything was for nothing. And not only were those people never brought to justice, the wrongdoers, but the prison's free to continue with that behavior. So I just wanted to call your attention to just the devastating effects that transfers have on people with pending court cases. I know that was a mouthful. Thank you so much for your attention and your patience.